everyone. Welcome. Okay, let me just wait for Instagram to connect. Thank you all for joining me. If you're joining from the future, if you're joining from the past, I don't know who's joining from the past, but thank you to future watchers for watching. Let me know if you're watching. If you're watching this live, please drop a hashtag or an emoji and let me know. Um, and if you're watching the replay, let me know. I check the comments, guys. I read the comments. So just let me know that you're here. I do use streaming software, so it's hard for me to know like who's really watching. So that's why I invite everyone to participate. But let's get started. And we're just going to start by taking 3 breaths at our own pace. Obviously, if you're driving, handling a baby, working with hot grease, don't, be safe, be safe. But if you're able to, let's just take 3 breaths together. My posture always changes so much when I do those breaths. And I have to say that I know so many people have told me that the way I breathe or the way I cue people to breathe, it can create a lot of anxiety. So if that's you, a lot of love. Thank you for bearing with my slowness and my need to create spaciousness. And if you found the breath grounding, again, drop an emoji. Let me know. So today we are actually right around the anniversary of the pandemic. I know it's triggering for a lot of folks, especially since the pandemic is still happening. So our beginning reading, our beginning words, if you're new to the live, every live I start just by taking breaths and then I read a passage from Alexis Pauline Gumbs or just from like a book that I think is powerful. Today, to honor the pandemic, I want to read from Care Work. And before I jump in, I also just want to share about who I am. My name is Opulence Abundance. I'm a conflict navigator. I am a speaker, a healing professional. I work with people one-on-one for healing. I work with organizations to support culture. I mediate conflicts. I basically do it all. I'm also a great facilitator. Yeah, and we're live today to really talk about freeze responses, to talk about how we can shift our freeze cycle, especially if we're chronic procrastinators. Procrastination is so painful, guys. And I know that if you've ever procrastinated, you ask yourself, why do I do it? But then you find yourself repeating the cycle. And it's so easy to go into self-blame. It's so easy to be like, it's me, I'm a failure. But I think the deeper truth is that it's actually maybe connected to our trauma. It might be connected to a freeze response. And I'm going to give some really tangible ways that we can address that and shift those patterns in our lives. And then we're going to talk about Jungian archetypes and being frozen and trauma and stories and Disney princesses. I'm really excited for that part of the live. But if you're with me, just drop an emoji so I know you're here. I really love the butterfly emoji if you want to offer that one. But yeah, we'll get to those tangible tips. But first, we're going to start by reading from Care Work. Okay, I'm just going to open to a random page, but kind of in the beginning. Okay, this is called Care Work in the Apocalypse, and I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs here. Oh, thank you all for the butterflies. I'm glad to know you all are here with me. Thank you for being here. Okay. When I began working on this book in July 2016, right after I quit the job at a giant corporate university that I had hoped would be an accessible way of making a living, but ended up giving me pneumonia for 3 months. I thought I'd just slap together a collection of all the pieces of writing I've done over the past decade. Essays about curating QD BIPOC, performance art, the Femme Shark Manifesto. But as I edited this book over summer 2017, I realized that the pieces were the most prominent were all ones that I'd written about disability just and care labor in many forms. The theme of care work as a place where disability justice and queer femme emotional labor intersects came to me. Nothing about us without us is a disability rights slogan that was created by South African disability rights groups in the 1980s. A more recent disability justice slogan I have heard that I first saw on an image since invalid created in protest of the killing intersections of racism and ableism in the Israeli bombardment of Gaza in the summer of 2014 is to exist is to resist. This phrase speaks to the ways in which the everyday struggle to live and survive by sick and disabled, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color are real activism. When you are lying in bed trying to breathe, or talking someone through a panic attack, or fighting Medicaid, or the queer club to let you in, that is resistance. And in this political moment, where Trump is attempting to kill sick and disabled people by ending Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, and the ADA, and where the things that do save us emerge in airport demonstrations against Trump's Islamophobic and racist travel immigration bans, care webs, where we raise money for medical and housing surpluses, are so clearly not the state. This book feels timely. I also wrote this book with a lot of anxiety. I was very conscious during the process of compiling and editing that it would be the first on disability justice by a queer writer of color that was not self or micro press published. This is huge and telling that the racism and ableism of the publishing industry mean there are barely any popular books out there on disability, and the vast majority of them are written by white disabled people. Like every other disabled writer I know, I've been asked if I think readers will really know what ableism is. I've had pieces about disability politics be read with incomprehension by editors who said, "Don't you want to say more about your illness?" And we're confused that I'm not telling the only disabled story they can comprehend. A simple, tragic, yet uplifting tale where I talk about my illness and how I've overcome it, but a story of collective struggle, community building, love and luck and skills. Like every disabled Black and brown writer I know, I've fought to get anyone to give a shit or to not just throw up their hands at how way too complicated my story is. Can't I just focus on my brownness or ableism? But I am a cultural worker who is one disabled femme of color writer in a collective of many. I was clear about what I did and did not want this book to be. For the past year, I've thought a lot about what I wanted to do to intervene in the very likely reality that as I am a light-skinned, non-Black, ambulatory, often verbally communicative person, mainstream media would want to cast me as the face of disability justice and thrust into the spotlight as one of the experts on this wacky new movement, erasing all my comrades and fellow artists, thinkers, and organizers, particularly those who face certain kinds of ableism. They are more overt and killing than some that I face. This fear didn't come out of nowhere. I had one offer to publish this book that meant very well talking about how the time had come for a big book on disability justice, but then admitted that in mainstream publishing, unless you're willing to pitch yourself as the expert, essay books don't sell. I want to be very clear. I'm one writer and performer in a sea of sick and disabled, queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color who are doing work in many ways all the time as writers and activists and as everyday folks who are keeping themselves and other people alive. I do not want this book to be the book on disability justice. This book is one in a garden of books that I invoke to become more abundant. All right, let's just take a breath to take all that in. Hello, Alyssa. Hi, Diana. If you're just joining, if the reading resonated with you, please drop some emojis. Let me know how you felt about it. I'm so excited to be here with you all. So, some of the ideas I just want to pull out that I found really powerful in this reading are one, the origin of nothing about us without us being a disability rights slogan that was created in South Africa in the 1980s by disability justice groups. And also Leah Lakshmi capturing the origin of to exist is to resist, being coming from 2014 in Gaza, I think the way that Leah Lakshmi is able to capture and track these important phrases and movement history is really powerful. And I also think the way that she denies celebrity. She says, I'm not going to sell out my peers so that I can be the face. I am going to continue to remind people that the story that is up for consumption is not my personal story of illness, but the story that I'm going to offer to the world is actually a tale about what can happen when we come together. And I also just love the validation of these many different acts of like what is and isn't resistance. I think this reading is so relevant today. Care Work by Leah Lakshmi. Read it, friends. Okay, let's just take a breath as we transition from our reading. And for our movement practice today, if you're able, and this is just going to tie directly in with our learning today. So we're going to create a little energy ball. I know this is kind of cheesy theater practice, but it's also cheesy qigong practice. So if you're able, and you can do this if you're doing something else, you can just visualize it. But if you're like watching this straight up, which I would admire, you can use your hands. So we're going to just imagine just pulsing between our hands. Maybe start by rubbing our hands together and feeling that warmth. And when we pull it apart, we can imagine there's like a little ball of light there, right? And we can pulse it back and forth. And so then we can start adding our breath into it. So on the inhale, it expands, and on the exhale, we concentrate it back down. And we can just do it from different sides. Okay, so we have this little ball. And just knowing the ball in this state, when we're not expanding or contracting it, this is kind of our baseline, right? I don't know what's going on for y'all, but I have to say whenever I do this, I can like feel the warmth in it. But just wanted to create this because it does represent our nervous system in some way. And just this is the rhythm of our life. In a lot of ways that we're meant to expand, get really big, and we're meant to contract. And if we get stuck in a contraction, we can't. We want to expand, but we can't. We feel the urge to inhale, but we can't. Then we're kind of paralyzed, right? And that's when the breaths get really shallow. Similarly, if we're expanded and we go for that contraction, but we're stuck out here, that's also a form of paralysis, right? So just wanted to name that to really ground what we're talking about today, which is, we're kind of talking about having symptoms of ADHD, which we're increasingly living in a world where it seems like everyone is having symptoms of ADHD, right? And to have these symptoms and then to be expected to meet the demands of everyday life is really difficult. And so then a lot of us respond to that by seeking out medication to help us move. And sometimes that medication does work, but sometimes the medication leads us to feeling very dissociated, having trouble sleeping. There's questions about brain health and sustainability. And so this issue of how we function is quite complex, especially because so many of us are just navigating real life, right? And oftentimes we're just up against the demand. If we have children, if we have a demanding job, maybe both, maybe also caregiving for a parent, there's so many demands on us that we don't really have the time to work through things. We just need the solution. And so just holding that, like, let's just take a breath of compassion for ourselves, for each other. Just like know that we are navigating some really complex situations that are unkind. Okay, so this is the part of the video where I'm going to just lead us into talking about ADHD and how procrastination gets involved in the cycle. Then we're going to go into some very clear suggestions. And then we'll talk about the Jungian stuff. Okay, so First of all, when we think about procrastination is very often feeling overwhelmed, feeling scared about something we have to do. And if you experience procrastination, hit me with an emoji, okay? Let me know if you are a procrastinator. I for sure am a procrastinator, or I used to be a really bad procrastinator. I'm not so much anymore, and I'm excited to share what changed for me. But procrastination ruins lives, guys. Like, procrastination is really hard to manage. Oh, I see you, friend. I see you. Thank you for your emoji. Um, it ruins lives for sure, because we find ourselves, if we have something to do and then we're avoiding it, and then it's hanging over us when we're hanging with friends, when we're eating dinner, like, and it keeps us from going to bed at night, but at the same time we're not making action on it. And what's going on is that procrastination is a defense mechanism. So we're overwhelmed and we're immobilized by something that we have to do. We may not know how to do it. There might be layers of avoidance going on. Very common perfectionism is a huge reason we avoid things, because we know we want to do it perfectly. We have an expectation. We know that expectation is unmeetable. So then what do? We avoid it. So we're avoiding failing, right? So these can be some of the mind games going on. We're all different. I'm just naming some possibilities. And as painful as it is, I think it can be helpful to capture these things, because if perfectionism is a thing for you, perfectionism is deeply tied to shame. Um, and so we really have to do some of that inner healing work, let ourselves off the hook for the shame, let ourselves know that we can do something imperfectly, right? And we're going to get into those tangible ways to reapproach. But when we procrastinate, it's actually a coping skill or defense mechanism that, defense mechanisms help us cope. Coping skills help us cope with our overwhelming emotions. The issue with procrastination is that by engaging this defense mechanism, because it's subconscious, right? We are actually increasing the anxiety response. Each time we procrastinate, the anxiety increases. So then the loop is that means we continue to respond with procrastination, so avoidance, and then it increases, avoids, avoids, until the cycle is broken. And what happens for a lot of people with ADHD, and again, drop an emoji if this feels familiar. Let me know if I'm speaking to you. What happens is then we drive ourselves into like activation and expansion response. Um, and we fight, flight, freeze, and like we fight or flight till we get that thing done. And the urgency is the motivator. But the cost to the human is intense, right? Like, this is how I graduated. This is how I survived undergrad. So I know that, like, the cost of the cost of sorry for my pause here, but just the cost to my sleep, to my body, to my psyche was extreme. And that's why we're here. That's why we want to shift these patterns. So let's just take a breath. Just celebrating our desire to shift the pattern, because they say that's like what sows the seeds for the healing. Like, even the desire to change the pattern, we're already changing the pattern. So let me get into some tangible ways that I shifted my patterns. So the first one is to nourish the baseline. And by this I mean, like, if you can have one habit, whether like it's you go on a walk every morning, you sit down and breathe for 10 minutes every morning. My one grounding habit is that I do watch a YouTube video on breath work every morning. It's a 10-minute video. And I just like wake up, sit on my daybed, turn that on and do it. And that is my grounding habit. Grounding habits are very important. And James Clear wrote that book, Atomic Habits. You've probably seen it everywhere. I listened to a little bit on audiobook, and I found one of the suggestions he gave is something called habit stacking. So we start with one habit, which might be to like wake up and brush our teeth. And then to be with a habit, be very specific on what you're doing and name the time and place you're going to do it. So if you want to go on a daily walk, be very clear. It's like, I'm going to go on that daily walk at noon during my lunch break, and I'm going to set an alarm in my phone, or I'm going to go right when I get off of work, or I'm going to wake up, brush my teeth, then go on the walk. And then when you have an established habit, it does allow you to add habits. Don't jump to this step, my ADHDers, okay? We sometimes do too much, then we crash. So just start with that one nourishing habit that can be a safe baseline for you. And definitely waking up or going to bed, those are the times. I know that if it's heavy procrastination, there can be this voice that's like, you don't have time to do that. And I agree. If you are like, if you have a little baby, if you have different things going on, there legitimately might be things that take precedence. But what I would also say is resist the voice and understand that even you taking a minute of just like, so the habit can be, I'm going to wake up and just take 3 breaths before I start my day. That's enough. That's enough to shift these cycles. So really, or it can be, I'm going to take 3 breaths, like, well, let's just start like when you wake up. I'm going to take 10 intentional breaths. I'm going to take 3 intentional breaths. Know that making time for that is hugely important. There is going to be a lot of resistance. Resistance comes up when we're making changes, and it's totally normal. It's okay. Um, it might feel impossible. We'll feel really emotional contraction around this idea of the 3 breaths, and we'll avoid it. We might procrastinate around it. My advice to that is like, one, I'll do a video on resistance next week because it's so interesting to talk about. But my advice to that is just keep trying. Don't shame yourself when you don't do it, and just really learn to celebrate yourself for the recommitment. So just want to name that resistance is normal. It's normal to struggle, but the more we can have a habit where we're returning to ourselves and nourishing the baseline is really powerful. And the reason nourishing the baseline is powerful is because we can think that we're regulated, but we can actually be in an activation state. And it's just very difficult to think clearly, to make wise decisions, to have impulse control or good judgment when we're activated. So, as much as possible, we want to try and regulate that nervous system, right? When we do the expansion and contraction, we want to be living with our healthy energy ball. We don't want to be here. We don't want to be here. Want to be here. Okay. So my next piece of advice is to know yourself. So a lot of ADHD advice talks about body doubling. Very important for some people. For me, I realized that when I was in my home with my roommate who I adored, just hearing another person would actually cause me to contract. I'd feel it. I'd be like doing good. I'd be in my zone. I would hear someone else. And knowing that and understanding like, oh, I must have trauma that I might not even know or understand or be able to give voice to, but what I can see is the impact of that trauma. I think sometimes we get so caught up in trying to figure out like our trauma story, and it can be so salacious and we want to figure out who to blame, but I'm going to say, let the trauma story go. Just observe the impacts on you. And so I realized I became very constricted, very frozen, very hyper vigilant, just at the presence of another person. So for me, body doubling, which is what everyone will suggest, that actually just pushes me into hypervigilance. I actually do my best work alone. And of course, there are times where I want to work in a cafe, but then there are times where I just need a lot of silence. So know yourself. Think about, just observe yourself, take note of what you see, track your symptoms, and then connect the dots, right? So if you're feeling frozen, shut down, disassociated, numb, those are all hypoarousals. Those are contractions. But if you're feeling heart beating, so busy you can't focus, you're starting a lot of projects but not finishing them, that kind of points to expansion or hyperarousal. So just do some good self-observation, and that will tell you a lot about your patterns and what you need. And if you are ever going to a health professional, it's really going to benefit you to know what those symptoms are. Hi, Zumi. So glad you're here today. Okay, so the next tip for working with a deep freeze response is to, for me, okay, so we talked about that cycle of like procrastinating, having something, and then when it's like 4 hours until it's due, that's when you like slip into an activated response to get things done. So the way that I found to break that cycle is to actually, and there might be so much resistance to this, but it is to create a schedule. And so this sounds so crude, but that way I felt that pressure of like, I got to get this done. Like when I had scheduled and said, okay, I have like 2 hours to work on this. And then, so maybe that first hour, I'm just like checking Facebook, checking my email. Um, and then in that second hour, I'm like, oh my God, this is my only time all week to get this done. It's gonna mess up my week. And so that's like when there can be some of that urgency. I think this is kind of a funny tip because it's not an underlying healing. It's like, how do we work with the waves of our activation with what we're working with? And in that kind of same idea, I do think it's important. Sorry, I blinked out, but I think knowing what we're working with is so important. So if I am having a distractible day and I'm realizing that in doing some sort of work, I need to I need a distraction. I'm seeking a distraction. I do just try and not shame that and pause and say like, okay, then do I need a work environment that is somewhat distracting? Do I need to work at a coffee shop? Do I need, and coffee shops, I think, have been successful for me, or working somewhere external to my home because there is a time limit there. And then if I get too comfortable in a coffee shop, go to a different one, right? And there's some discomfort that makes me be like, okay, I want to get home or I want to leave the space. I need to finish because I want to leave the space. So that can be a great tool. And then similarly, if I'm in my home and I'm realizing like I'm thinking through this thing, but I'm noticing I wanna exit it somewhat compulsively, then I might put on, like, a TV show or something in the background, and that is kinda how I work with it. The other big thing that helped me kind of shift my procrastination pattern, and these patterns really showed up for me when I was in graduate school, and I was on Adderall. It didn't always help, guys. Sometimes it just turns up the volume on the procrastination, unfortunately. Or sometimes, like, when I would take those things that I did need. Like I do have ADHD, but sometimes I noticed that I would focus on everything but what I needed to do. So instead of like completing the presentation, I would like organize all my files. And it's just this way that like sometimes we can't medicate avoidance. And we're getting closer to talking about the healing part. We're still kind of in like, what are these tips that work with it? But the big one that helped me is when I had a paper, it's breaking down the steps of any task. So core to procrastination is like not knowing and then feeling a lot of fear, anxiety, perfectionism to pressure us to like complete what we're doing or to make that task feel impossible. So my strategy was when I got like an assignment for an essay that felt overwhelming, I would just try and do the easy parts first. So even just set up the document, add the title page, add the header, the footer, do the little things that were easy first, right? And often when we're thinking about procrastination or like when we're noticing a procrastination response, what we need to do, and this is why a timer can be helpful because we're feeling that avoidance resistance in our body, can be helpful just put on a 20-minute timer. So, or a 10-minute timer to say, like, okay, I'm just going to work on this for 10 minutes and I'm just going to commit to not getting distracted. If I feel the desire to get distracted or I do get distracted, I'm just going to bring myself back. If I'm working on a paper and then I start working on it and I'm like, oh, I have to pay my light bill, I'm just going to take note of that. I'm going to have like a little piece of paper or a note stock open and I'm just going to put pay my light bill. Then I'm going to go back to my task. When I'm doing the task, the first step is to be like, what are the smaller baby steps of this task? So if it's writing an essay, I need to set up the title page in the document. Okay, I can do that, right? I feel good about doing that. I need to get some sources. That feels overwhelming. I have to like go to the library or go, I don't know how to do that. So, but that's okay. We're just going to list it. And then it's like, okay. And then I have to share my thoughts. And so then you can look at that list and then you can be like, okay, I'm going to do this for 20 minutes. I'm going to do this for 20 minutes. I'm going to do this for 20 minutes. So that's just some like very basic time management how to approach things when you're deep in procrastination. And just to review those steps, you're going to make some time to do a little planning and list out. You might use a timer to prevent you from getting distracted. If you things come up while you're in that timer focus accountability zone, um, you're just going to take note of them. When the timer is up, you get a little break. Okay, you get to you get to play the internet game or watch the TV or like do whatever you do to procrastinate, and then you come back and do another time segment, and hopefully you can increase it a little. You have to work with yourself for your window of tolerance, but hopefully after you take that first big step of the first 20 minutes or 10 minutes, um, there's an ease of that resistance, which is why we start with 20 minutes. We don't start with an hour because you want it to be really achievable and you want to succeed and you want to create a positive feedback loop for yourself. If this is helpful, let me know. Emojis are great. But if you already kind of know this, let me know. If you have specific questions, please let me know. But this was all life-changing for me. Like, as soon as I got an assignment, I would just open it up and I'd create the document. And then when I would think about that thing randomly while I was procrastinating, I could return to that document and start putting things in there. So I think understanding we don't have to climb the mountain in a day, but we can instead turn towards little steps. It's a different way of thinking and it can be difficult. And sometimes the resistance can be big, which kind of brings us to my final real big, well, there's two more tips, but the second to last tip is just like, sometimes it helps to work with someone else. So that could just be co-working on Zoom and the other person's presence keeps you responsible. Or it could be more hands-on and actually talking through with someone like, hey, I have this paper due in a week and I'm avoiding it. Like, can we talk through what I have to do? I'm really stressed out. It's been hard for me. And so sometimes having another person there can really help us stay present and get moving. The thing about avoidance is it can create so much shame. And the more we avoid, the more emotion builds around what we're avoiding. But we have to understand that the emotion is not reality. And in truth, when we turn towards something and confront it, it's solvable or it's not, but it's ultimately on us, And so my final tip is kind of like when we think about these interventions is just to keep it simple. Try one thing at a time. You don't have to be perfect. We are talking so much about perfection. And I think it is really innately tied to procrastination and shame and ultimately survival. The need to feel perfect is often tied to survival. And sometimes one of the ways I go to the roots of these issues is just by checking in with my younger self and being like, wow, you really felt the need to be perfect in school. And if you weren't perfect in school, maybe there would have been a big consequence. So sometimes just talking to my younger self and being like, wow, it must have been so scary to feel the need to do things perfectly. And just to remind my adult self, like, I am no longer in school. Nobody is going to abandon me. Nobody is going to harm me if I do something imperfectly. So just taking a breath to feel that, to like know that like we are safer in our lives. There's more choice, there's more space, there's more autonomy. And if you are feeling really like that unsafety, and maybe you are living a life where perfection is needed, I do think one way to release some of the fear responses is by scanning your environment. So that looks like turning your head all the way to one side, starting at the bottom corner and moving your eyes up and down, and then slowly turning your head as you scan your whole environment, moving eyes from up to down, then down to up. And this is just one way to kind of almost like release that hypervigilance response because you're literally scanning the environment. I want to just share that, like, I'm a conflict mediator, and sometimes when I do conflicts, they're really activating. And I am committed to not living my life in activation because, like procrastination, when we're activated, all of our body's resources are going towards our safety and like surveillance. fats. Okay. So we are not digesting, we're not doing all the magical things. Like our collagen isn't refreshing, so we want to make sure that we are in a regulated state. Some things I do, because when I go into a conflict, I'm having to be honest with people, it terrifies me. And so some of the things I do to kind of capture that anxiety is, or like after the mediation, when I'm still activated, is I will go on a walk. I will call a friend. I will take a shower, right? And all of these things kind of help me come down. And I can tell I'm coming down when I start yawning a lot. So yawning is one of the ways I know. It's important for you to find those practices for yourself. I want to touch base quickly on this idea of safe mobilization and unsafe mobilization. Safe immobilization and unsafe immobilization. So, safe mobilization is exercise. We're not running from a bear, we're just running because we like to run. Okay, so that's safe mobilization. Unsafe mobilization is we're activated because maybe our partner said or did something earlier in the day, and we're not dealing with our emotions about that, but we are activated. So we got in our car and decided to drive across the country, or we're like frantically looking for something, or we're like creating a bunch of tasks and putting pressure on ourselves to achieve them. So when we're in an activated state, we're unsafely mobilized. Very, like for me, I know that once I trace like, oh, I had an argument with a friend, and then I decided, oh, maybe I should just drive 4 hours to see my parents on a whim. And as I'm driving to my parents' house, I'm like, oh, this is a flight response that I haven't been catching. And I'm the whole time I'm driving, I'm talking to my friends on the phone. So activated. And people are like, you're driving? And I'm like, yeah, it's super quick. I just like to drive. Okay, but that's a flight response. It's a flight response. So similarly, unsafe immobilization. So immobile, we're not moving. For me, that is when I'm in a flight, when I'm in a freeze response, right? And I'm stuck on the couch. Feels impossible to move. I maybe feel fear. I feel the prickles on the back of my neck, right? I'm feeling I'm having some body reaction and I can't move. Safe immobilization. So safe stillness is meditation, taking those 3 breaths, reading a book, right? Sometimes we literally can't do these things because it just feels so unsafe. But sometimes we can do these things, and by creating moments where we feel safe and we're choosing to exercise, we feel safe, we're choosing to sit on the couch and read. Creating those states can help us develop a contrast and just widen our awareness and heal the nervous system. Okay, so much information shared today. Let's just take a breath. If you're still with me and you're able, please drop an emoji so I know who's here. Thank you all for being with me on this journey. We're reaching the final part of this live where I'm so excited to talk to you all about what was in the newsletter, which if you don't read the newsletter, oh, I'm glad you're here with me, friend. You've been here from the start. So glad to write out this live with you. Thank you for being here with me. Anyways, so in the newsletter, and if you don't subscribe to my newsletter, there's a link in my bio. I update twice weekly right now, most of the time just weekly. And I actually have some really exciting news. I am waiting to share this, but I'm going to Japan. I'm so excited. It's a big bucket list item. Definitely let me know if you've ever been, or if you're going on any fun travels. But I'm actually only going to be sharing about those journeys on the newsletter. So if you want to stay connected, this is the time to subscribe. But on the newsletter this week, I shared a lot of images of Disney princesses, and I talked about how when I think about my freeze state, for some reason, Disney princesses come to mind. And in addition to that, like I personally, okay, didn't put this in the newsletter, but if you know me, I have kind of a princess complex. And for the longest time, I've just been like, I have to accept this about myself because it's so innate and it's just like so much towards what I gravitate towards. but also like, what's this about? And I had a big light bulb as I was writing the newsletter last night where I was like, oh my gosh, I actually haven't looked at these Disney princess stories in a long time, but there is something significant going on about these stories and about trauma. Um, it's about the stories, it's about trauma, it's also about the freeze response. And I guess like thinking about these stories of princesses who are targeted by these like villains who are also women. And then they like they're cursed or they go through something and some of them are literally immobilized until they're kissed awake. I think it was really interesting for me to think about the crone or the villain, like the witch, as just another aspect of one psyche. So the princess and the crone, the princess and the witch as the same person. And the princess understanding like being a younger self, an innocent self. What came to mind for me as I was examining these stories is just understanding how when we experience trauma, it is disorganizing and it fragments us. And we can compartmentalize different versions of ourselves, right? And so the compartmentalized princess is naive. She's connected to animals. She's safe. She's pure, right? But that version of self doesn't get to exist. And what happens when that version of self is something we're stuck in, that we're existing within in response to trauma. And then seeing the witch as someone that, like, the desire to kill the princess, which, like, it doesn't have to be that violent in our healing. We can integrate them but just naming like, okay, we can't stay in this state forever, right? And so thinking about even the symbols of magic, of power, of energy that these villains, quote unquote, villains often have. And even thinking of the villains as queer coded, right? And so there's something going on about how we grow and develop. The part that like doesn't resonate or I'm still thinking about is the prince awakening and just like how sexuality can both awaken our trauma, it can pull us out of a frozen state. It can also drive us back in there. So there's a lot of complexities, but just I think Jungian psychology, looking at archetype, looking at symbols in our lives, and understanding how those things connect can be really powerful. I think that for me, my princess complex has really also been connected to the parts of me that are traumatized and forever frozen. And just to acknowledge that when we heal deeply, when we heal genuinely, sometimes there is a lot of grief and we do kill a part of ourselves. And that's why there's resistance. That's why it can be scary. And that's why you got to work with a professional. But thank you all for joining me today for this rich discussion on how we can shift our cycles of work, how we can deal with procrastination, and how we can heal deeper. Thank you for that emoji, Diana. Again, please subscribe to the newsletter. Love you all. I hope you have a great day. Bye.